Computer. All right. We are back again for another episode, this time with Mr. Mike Maharrey. We haven't had Mike on in a couple of years, I don't think. So this will be a fun conversation, especially with all the tariff talk and everything that's going on in the economy. Mike's really good on this stuff. So, but before we get to that, libertarianinstitute.org/donate is where you're going to go to donate your money to us so that you can keep our podcast, our writers, and our books flowing. You want to keep the Institute running, you go to libertarianinstitute.org/donate and donate your money. We will love to take it from you. But yeah, that's how you keep the Libertarian Institute going. That's how you support all of us that are working over there. And don't don't leave us hanging. So we're about halfway to our goal, I believe, and we are just rocking and rolling, trying to keep it going. So just go donate 5, 10, $15, whatever you can afford, and help us keep running over there at the libertarianinstitute.org. As you all know, in May of 2024, I made a huge step. I quit smoking. I realized after 28 years of smoking, my quality of life had diminished significantly. I couldn't complete seemingly menial tasks without experiencing shortness of breath. I had had enough. But as smokers know, quitting is a big decision. Over the years, you reflexively begin to make decisions around your ability to feed your habit, and you become a slave to your vice. This is when I began utilizing nicotine pouches. All the nicotine, none of the shallow breathing. It's a win-win. Now I'm proud to announce Year Zero is an affiliate of Alp nicotine pouches. I don't have my Alp on me today. I got to go grab it. Alp is by far the best nicotine pouch that I've tried since embarking on a smokeless life. Its long-lasting flavor and burst of nicotine satisfy my cravings for hours at a time. It comes in a variety of flavors. My go-to is wintergreen. I love wintergreen. I don't know why. Maybe because when I was younger, I did dip and I dipped wintergreen flavored Grizzly. Check the description of this podcast for a link that allows you to set up recurring orders delivering Alp satisfaction to your door and get 10% off your order. If you're looking for all the benefits of straight nicotine without the tar and chemicals of cigarettes, I can't out recommend Alp enough. Your lungs will thank you, your breath will thank you, and your wallet will thank you. If you place an order of $70 or more, you will also be rewarded with free shipping. That's 5 logs or 15 cans recurring each month with free shipping and 10% off your purchase when you use the link in the description below. If you're done with tobacco but love nicotine, click the link in the description and get your Alp shipped out to you today. All right. Now we wait for Mr. Mike Maharrey. I'll be back in just a minute.
As pretty as it gets.
All right. Here he is, Mike Maharrey. He's back again. It's good to have you back, man.
It's good to be back. It's been a while, hadn't it?
It has. It's been I think a year and a half or 2 years. It's been a while.
Yeah, that sounds about right. It's my life has been crazy the last couple of years with my mom being ill and then
Yeah.
moving and it seems like one thing after another. But anyway,
Yeah.
it's good to be here. Glad to talk to you, man.
Yeah. It's good to have you. Obviously I always call you on to do Federal Reserve topics, but this time we're going to talk tariffs and some of the economic stuff that's going on with the Trump administration.
Yeah.
Um, I was just telling you, I just got done listening to Scott Bessent on the All In podcast. So he was kind of filling the guys in on what the plan actually is and how they're actually looking at the economy. And one of the first things he said that really caught my attention was he saying what the Biden and Harris administration had done over the last 4 years was they inflated the market. So they inflated Wall Street, creating the stock market to go up, and in return, the prices of goods went up, but the average pay of employees of workers didn't go up along with it. So that's why on Main Street, people were actually feeling the pain when they were saying all along, well, the economy's great. The economy's recovered. The economy's in good shape. And that was one of the first things that caught my mind or caught my ear was the ability for them not only to inflate the money supply, but also to inflate the stock market, I thought was kind of wild. I'd never heard that talked about, so I was wondering if you could kind of fill us in on how that operates.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I would caution folks, though, from my point of view, to get really partisan about it because I know that's the world we live in, and everybody likes to, Biden did this, and now Trump's going to do this.
Mhm.
There really is a trajectory in the economy that is nonpartisan. It kind of goes in the same direction no matter who's in office. So we can go back and look at the Trump administration prior, and we can see the same inflation
Mhm.
of the stock market. We can see price inflation. These things are not specific to an administration. I really focus mostly primarily on my like big picture macro view on what is the Federal Reserve doing with the money,
Mhm.
because that's really the source in our particular system of the money creation and the inflationary pressure. It's not so much from the varying administrations. Now, they're obviously contributing to it. And what I like to say is that the Federal Reserve is the engine that drives the biggest, most powerful government in the history of the world. We can debate whether it's the biggest, most powerful. I can make some points that it is. You might say Rome was bigger and more powerful. Okay, fine. One of the biggest and most powerful governments in the history of the world. And it is enabled by the Federal Reserve's ability to print money, to create money out of thin air. So let me just real quick give an overview of kind of what happens so that we can start with this kind of as a baseline. You've got the government and it is spending and borrowing billions and billions of dollars. In fact, if you look at the recent Treasury reports, they put one out every month, you will find that on average, and this has been going on for the last couple of years, the federal government is spending about $500 billion every single month. And that's including Social Security, all of the spending. It's bringing in roughly 300 to 400 trillion dollars every single month. So you can see that there's a discrepancy there. They're constantly spending more than they're bringing in. So that means they have to borrow money. They borrow money by selling treasuries. They sell these bonds out on the open market. People buy them. It's basically just like me and you entering into an agreement to pay a loan. I'll give you $10,000, and I say you say I'll give this back to you in 5 years with 10% interest. It's basically what the government does. Where the Federal Reserve enters into the equation is it can go out on the open market and it can buy those treasury bonds and it can put them on its balance sheet and basically take them out of circulation. So what this does is it creates artificial demand. If the Federal Reserve wasn't buying so much of government debt, then it would become impossible on the open market for the federal government to continue borrowing and spending at the low interest rates that it has been. These operations tend to happen more when you have an economic problem, right? The government has to borrow and spend even more when there's a crisis. We saw it in 2008. We saw it during the pandemic. The pandemic is the most recent example. And during those 2 years, the Federal Reserve bought almost $5 trillion in government debt and inserted that amount of cash into the economy. That is by definition inflation. When we talk about inflation, that is really what we're talking about. We're talking about this increase in the money supply. This also happens through borrowing and credit, right? When banks make loans because they don't have to back those loans 100%, then they're effectively creating money. They may have, $10,000 backing a $100,000 loan. So it's inserting more and more money into the system. So that's why artificially low interest rates also create money
Mhm.
because it incentivizes borrowing. More borrowing means an increase in this overall money supply. So that's really what's at the root of inflation. Price inflation, what you're paying at the grocery store, that is a symptom of this monetary inflation.
Right.
It's basic logic. If you have more dollars, each dollar is worth less than it was before. The more
Mhm.
dollars you add, the less each individual dollar is worth, and that is reflected in rising prices. As you have noted, this inflation in prices that's due to monetary inflation doesn't just show up in the consumer prices. It shows up in the stock market. It shows up in real estate. It shows up in art. It shows up in anything where you can buy stuff. You'll see this rapid inflation of prices. And it's interesting because during the 2008 financial crisis and the Great Recession that followed, that was really the first big experiment in quantitative easing, this bond purchasing. And they did almost $4 trillion that time, did it over a much longer period of time. And interestingly, a lot of people were predicting in 2008, 2009, oh my gosh, we're going to have this huge bout of price inflation. It never happened. That's because the banks didn't lend that money out. They mostly held it on their balance sheet, and a lot of it ended up kind of manifesting itself into the asset market. So we saw this big increase in the stock market during the Trump administration. And it's interesting because toward 2018, getting into 2019, the Federal Reserve started to try to normalize interest rates. For 10 years after the Great Recession, they kept everything artificially low, a lot of easy money, a lot of new debt, trying to stimulate the economy. They created all of this new money. And then in 2017, 2018, they started to say, okay, we need to try to normalize this. We can't have 0% interest rates forever. And when that happened, we had this big shakeup in the economy. And a lot of people probably don't even remember this, but in the fall of 2018, we saw a big stock market crash. And what did the Fed do? They stopped raising interest rates. They actually started cutting interest rates, and then they went back to quantitative easing. This was before the pandemic. And I often say that the pandemic kind of bailed the Federal Reserve out. It allowed them to double down on this, what I like to call monetary malfeasance. And they did. And again, they did more quantitative easing, more money creation in the year and a half of the pandemic than they did in the entirety of the aftermath of the Great Recession. This time, it did show up in consumer prices. We did get the bout of price inflation that you would often expect when you have all of this money printing. And the Fed was forced to raise interest rates up to, 5.5%. They've started trying to shed the assets off their balance sheet. They're no longer running quantitative easing right now. And that's why you're seeing these interest rates increase. That's a big problem for the federal government, by the way, who is seeing its interest expense go from under $1 trillion to over $1 trillion in a very short amount of time. The federal government right now is paying more for interest on the national debt than it is for Medicare, than it is for national defense. There's only one spending category right now that is higher than interest, and that's Social Security. So all of this really goes to what the Federal Reserve is doing and how the money printing is going. And so during the Biden administration, we were still feeling the aftermath of all of that pandemic money creation. We still had it juicing the stock market, even though the Fed was actually raising interest rates during some of that period. And it did cool the price inflation down a little bit, but now they've declared victory and they're kind of pivoting back to that easy money. Well, guess what's going to happen, right? So if you look at things right now, we're kind of in this, the Fed and the government are kind of in this catch-22 because they need to keep interest rates higher in order to keep that price inflation under control. They really need to raise interest rates more, I would argue, to wring more of this inflation out of the economy. And yet at the same time, all of this money creation, this loose monetary policy has created all kinds of bubbles. Stock market bubble being probably the most obvious, but there's also a real estate bubble. There's a huge debt bubble. Everybody is levered and buried in debt up to the hilt. And so the economy is not designed to function in a higher interest rate environment. And so what does the Fed do? They simultaneously need to raise and lower interest rates. Can't do that. So it's going to be interesting to see how they walk this tightrope and which side they fall off, because they're going to have to fall off on one side or the other. So I think that the analysis is correct. The stock market isn't a huge bubble. I would argue that it's not merely a function of Biden, that this is really goes all the way back to 2008.
Hmm. Okay. So you mentioned a lot there, and a lot of it applies to some of the things I wanted to talk about. So we're going to take it like step by step
Yeah,
here.
break it down.
So what Besant was saying was what they're planning on doing, and like you said, it's a tightrope. He said, he even mentioned, he goes, this is a very unique position that we find ourselves in, and what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to play the tariff game in order to bring industry back to the United States. therefore we can increase the amount of income that people are bringing in uh, as far as the workers go. Therefore, that the price inflation that you're witnessing at the grocery store will not necessarily drop very far, but your standard living will increase because we'll lower your taxes, will increase the amount of jobs and the pay of the jobs here locally, and also at the same time be deflating the stock market.
Yeah. I really, I kind of disagree with that take because, and just to be real up front, I'm not a fan of tariffs.
Hmm.
And I remember back in the day, we used to hear Republicans all the time. They would say, you can't tax your way to prosperity. Well, what's a tariff? A tariff is fundamentally a tax. And it is what it is. Now, we can debate and argue about tariff policy because other countries apply tariffs too. And you can say, well, we need to apply tariffs to even things out. Okay, let's just set that aside and look at it from a purely economic standpoint. A tariff is a tax. A tax is not going to make everybody better off in the long run. It might make some people better off, as any economic policy does. Minimum wage makes some people better off, makes some people lose their job. So you always have to look at every side of any type of policy like this. There's a great quote by Bastiat, who was a French economist and a philosopher, and he basically said that a good economist takes into account what is seen and he takes into account what is unseen. And it's easy to take into account the scene. Go to the minimum wage example. You impose the minimum wage. People that are working in those jobs, they get a raise, they get more money. That's the scene. Good, yay, happy. Minimum wages are great. What is unseen is all the people who cannot get a job at that higher wage rate, that can't get above that wage floor, that never get jobs or lose their jobs. So you have to take both sides of it. I think on the whole, tariff policies are going to be more detrimental to the economy than people think that it's going to be. We can say, oh, yeah, it's going to raise wages because we're going to bring manufacturing back to the United States. Well, first off, are we really? I don't really think that we're going to see this influx of manufacturing come back. Now, there may be some high tech kind of things that come back to the US, but by and large, you're talking about a long time span. It's not like you can just say, oh, okay, well, we're going to manufacture widgets here today. No, you have to have the capital to build a new factory, to hire new workers, to create new systems, to create new supply chains. In the meantime, you're just creating such a level of disruption in the global economy that you're going to feel a lot of pain in that time. And there's no guarantee it's going to happen because here's the reality. A lot of things can be made cheaper overseas because labor is cheaper. That's the bottom line. So, yeah, we might move some manufacturing back to the US, but it's going to cost more. Everything is going to cost more. So, you know, you have to look at the realities of the way inflation works in the system too. It is true that wages are lagging prices. They always do. But they also always catch up. And that's an argument some people that are pro-inflation will actually use. They'll say, well, eventually it all levels out because it's raising the entire price level,
Yeah.
a
A
rising tide
rising
rises
tide.
all
Yeah.
boats. Yeah. And so eventually your wages are going to catch up. It's true. But the people who really benefit from inflationary policies are the people who get the money first. Who's that? That's the banks. That's why the banks love inflation. So they can take this new money before it devalues, and then they can go out and they can put it in the stock market or they can buy bonds. That's why you see this asset inflation. So again, I can see the value from a strategic standpoint of some tariff policy. And I'll be honest, I don't really know the nuts and bolts. I can't say Canada levies this on this and China levies this on this. I do know, though, that ultimately it is a tax. It is going to raise prices on things that are in the realm of the tariffs. It is going to create a lot of supply chain disruptions. It already is. And I think the biggest problem with the situation now is that Donald Trump, the way that he negotiates, and you could argue that it's effective, but it's also it creates a lot of volatility because he'll come out tomorrow and he'll say, we're going to put a 50% tax on Mongolia. And everybody will freak out and the markets will react. And then 3 weeks later, we're only going to do a 25% tariff on Mongolia for now. And then it'll be time to do the tariff, and you'll say, we're going to put it off for a month. So you create all of this regime uncertainty. And I think that's part of the reason that you're seeing so much volatility in the stock market right now. So, overall, I'm not a big fan of the tariff things because, again, ultimately it's a tax, and
Hmm.
you're always going to be better in the long run with free trade than you are with imposing tariffs. Again, I understand that it's not really free trade, that there other countries are levying it. I can see the value in using tariff.
Oh, crap. What the hell just happened? We lost signal. Oh no.
We
There we
froze there
go.
for a second.
Yeah, we lost signal for a minute. My hotspot disconnected. Everything went haywire on me.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, I think it's because
That happens.
it's so cloudy out here. I'm gonna try to reconnect this
Uh,
hotspot. There it goes. Okay, okay, okay. So you were saying you're not a big fan of tariffs.
yeah. Overall, I'm not a big fan of tariffs in the big picture. I do see the value of tweaking tariff policy to make an even playing field. In other words, if you've got a country that is levying, substantial tariffs, then I think it's reasonable to say we're going to match that and try to, create a negotiation where we get lower tariffs for everybody. But this notion that we're going to somehow use tariffs to bring manufacturing back to the United States, I just don't really see that happening because of the nature of what manufacturing is and the fact that it is so expensive to manufacture basic things here in the United States. Plastic widgets, China's better at it. It's
Mm,
just the way it is. So, I think that, I don't mean to be totally anti tariff. I see the place,
hmm.
but you always have to remember a tariff is a tax. So if I come at you and say, there, Tommy, I'm going to raise your income tax 20%, but it's going to help you in the long run. You're going to be pretty skeptical of that, right?
Mm.
And I think there's every reason to be from an economic standpoint. I just don't see any evidence and anything in economic theory that tells me that this is going to ultimately be beneficial for the most people. Again, if you levy a huge tariff on foreign steel, yeah, it might benefit the U.S. steel industry, but it's going to raise the prices of automobiles and all the things that use steel. And whatever wage gains you might get in that industry, other people are going to pay the price because they're paying more for all of these products as well. So I'm just not real sanguine on the whole tariff thing. I wish it would stop.
Well, I have another question about tariffs because I heard somebody say this, and at the time I was driving, so I wasn't able to look at my phone and see who it was that was speaking. But what they said was that when you're shifting from an income tax economy to a tariff economy, that you're putting yourself in a better situation for a laissez-faire economy. Now, I've asked a few people about this, why they think this will happen. I've gotten a few different answers. A lot of people said they've never considered it. Do you have any ideas of why that would be a shift into the direction of a more laissez-faire economy?
Yeah, I think that, again, if we look at a tax, you know, one of the kind of fundamental principle in economics is that incentives matter, right? When you
Mhm.
incentivize things, those things tend to happen. When you disincentivize things, they tend not to happen. That's why you have the whole idea of sin taxes, right? We're going to raise taxes on alcohol because we're going to try to lower drinking because people recognize that incentives matter. When you're taxing income, there's a lot of disincentives within that tax system. Our tax system is horribly disincentivizing to entrepreneurship and a laissez-faire economy. That's a good way of putting it. When the government is taking 40-50% of your income and doing what it wants with it, well, then you can't do what you want with it. So that is by definition interfering with the market, interfering with your freedom. So I think that is true from an economic kind of principle standpoint. The problem is that in order for that to work in the United States, you're going to have to see massive cuts in government spending because there is no way in the world that tariffs alone can support the spending level that the United States is under. And I actually saw somebody that ran some of the numbers not too long ago, and I can't pull them off of the top of my head, and I don't remember who did it. But I mean, it was substantial. It was like you'd have to have 100% tariffs on everything in order to even start to come close to filling the budget gap. And
Hmm.
I don't think a lot of people recognize just how bad the spending problem is. And you know, we've heard a lot of talk about Doge, and it's really cool to see, you know, this kind of focus on getting some of the fat out of government and getting some of this unnecessary spending out and seeing that as being a focus. But here's the reality. You could cut every dollar of discretionary spending that the United States does. So when I say discretionary, it is at the discretion of Congress. So we're talking about national defense. We're talking about education, you know, Obamacare. All of that is discretionary spending. If you eliminated every bit of it, you would only cut the budget by 27%. The vast majority of government spending is in entitlements. And
Hmm.
people will get mad when you say entitlements because I paid into that and that's my money. Fine, call it what you want to, but
So
it
you
is
feel
what it is.
entitled, huh?
Yeah, exactly. But that is, you know, nearly two-thirds or three-quarters of the federal budget. So the spending problem is something that is going to have to be addressed before we can really do anything in terms of reforming the tax situation
Right.
because as long as the government is spending at the level that it is, it's just not sustainable. And again, the problem is all in things that nobody wants to talk about. Nobody wants to talk about reforming Social Security or fixing Medicare or Medicaid. Those are unpopular topics, right? Social Security is called the third rail of politics for a reason. You don't want to touch it, you get electrocuted. And so you have a bunch of people in Congress who are very short-sighted. You know, their time horizon is the next election, not
Hmm.
10 years down the road. They don't have any incentive to actually cut spending. They're going to keep kicking the can down the road until they run out of road. That's the ugly reality that we face. And so, you know, I love to talk about things like, you know, we could get rid of the income tax or all of these things. It would be great, but somebody's got to deal with the spending problem first. We have a bloated government that is spending us into oblivion.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be the massive issue that we're going to see here, because I've heard Howard Lucknick talk about how the goal of this administration, this second Trump administration, is to put together a 100-year plan similar to what China has done. And one of the things, I believe it was Howard Lutnick I heard mention this. One of the things he was talking about were the states taking over the entitlement programs and running them as state legislation and getting it out of the federal government's hands. And I don't think that Congress, no matter who it is in Congress, I mean, minus maybe Marjorie Taylor Greene and Rand Paul, Thomas Massey, maybe Anna Paulina Luna. I don't know. I might be able to pull a handful out of there that would be willing to take on that battle, but I don't think you're going to see a majority of Congress willing to, you know, send that authority down to the states. I think politically that's suicidal. So I think that's going to be a major battle is trying to figure out how to get the spending under control. You hear all these people when Doge is talking about USAID, given all the horrific things that USAID has done over the years, that we're fully aware of, as far as working hand in hand with the CIA, and they're like, well, yeah, but that's only 0.2% of the national spending, and it's like, okay, but we don't need it. We don't
Yeah,
need color revolutions all over the world. Like we
right.
don't need this. And so it's one of those things. It's like, can we cut that? 0.2%, and they're so resistant because there are people that are getting rich on it.
Yeah,
These
yeah,
NGOs run on that money.
yeah. You're exactly right. And you really that's the crux of the matter. You can have a person like Trump, and I kind of feel like Trump, I think I don't really think he's driven by principles.
Mm-mm.
I don't think he has like this overriding philosophy that he's wanting to implement. I think that he wants a legacy.
Yep, that's
I think
exactly
he
right.
wants a legacy. Now, that bodes well when you start trying to talk about long-term planning because that's legacy stuff, right? If he could implement a 100-year plan, that would be awesome. But
Hmm.
our political system isn't built for that. China's is, right? I mean, their culture is more long-term thinking anyway. And then they have a government system that, isn't really subject to the same type of election pressures and the pendulum swings that we have here in the United States. And we see the issue already with the recent little budget battle, right?
Hmm.
We had a budget, a continuing resolution that continued all the spending. It's we'll deal with that in 6 months. No, you won't. You absolutely won't. And David Stockman, who was the Office of Budget and Management Director for Ronald Reagan, he ran the numbers on the Republican budget, and looked at all of the tax cuts and the spending cuts and the spending increases. And we're looking at this massive increase in the deficit with this Republican spending plan. On the one hand, you've got a Doge, and everybody thinks, oh, we have that, so we're cutting spending. No, Congress isn't doing that. So you already have this kind of conflict between Trump, who may be looking at more of a long-term thing, and a Congress who, again, they're looking at 2026, when
Hmm.
they have the next election. So I'm not real optimistic about any kind of genuine reforms. And I'm more of the mind of if you're a person here in the United States, you need to be finding ways to shield yourself from what is coming down the pike because it's going to come down the pike. There has to be a reset. There has to be a reset, first off, just from all the monetary malfeasance that we've had since 2008. We haven't reckoned with that yet. We're still waiting. We had the dot-com bust back in the late 1990s, and that was kind of a reset. And then the Fed ran in and they threw all of this money and they kept interest rates artificially low and they blew up a housing bubble, right? And then eventually that housing bubble became unsustainable and it popped. And so then the Fed does what it does. It went back in, it cut interest rates to zero, it launches all of this quantitative easing, it blows up new bubbles. And then we had the pandemic and they doubled down. And we still haven't reckoned with that. We still haven't had our dot-com crash or our real estate crash that we've saw after the last two easing cycles. It is coming down the pike. And when you look at the economy right now, all of a sudden people are worried about recessions. It's really wild. If you go to the Atlanta Fed, they have what they call GDP now, and they give I think it's weekly. Every week they give a new forecast of what they think this quarter's GDP growth is going to be. And if you go back to like February 26th or so, they were predicting 2.3, I think it was 2.3% economic GDP growth for the first quarter. Not bad. 2 weeks later, it was minus 2.7. Like all of a sudden, it just went off a cliff. So everybody's all worried about a recession. Well, why is that? Well, if you listen to the mainstream, they're going to say, well, we're all worried about Trump's tariffs and Trump's tariffs are going to cause a recession. No, I don't think that's true. I mean, I think Trump's tariffs are definitely creating volatility in the market, as I've already mentioned. But the real problem is we've got this wasteland, right? It's like a grassland in a drought, and all the grass is withered up and dead. All it needs is a spark. And tariffs might be that spark, or it might be something else, but something ultimately is going to spark that, and we're going to see this economic adjustment that always has
Hmm.
to come. Every boom, and we've arguably been in a boom since 2009 or 10. Every boom is followed by a bust, and the bust is usually commensurate with the boom. In other words, the bust is usually as big as the boom. So look at how much the stock market has inflated over those years. Look how much real estate has inflated over those years. Look how much the debt bubbles have blown up during those years. All of that has to reset. So Trump may do some great things. He may not. take it as it is. But you, as an individual, need to be prepared financially for more inflation and an economic downturn because those are things you can count on. I guarantee you that no matter what happens with any policy or any administration, the federal government is going to continue to devalue your money. That's what it does. Inflation is not an accident. It's not something that just happens. It is a policy. It is on purpose. They talk about it all the time. We have a 2% inflation target. That means every year they want your money to devalue by 2%. And that means every 5 years, your money is devalued by 10%, right? So every 10 years, 20%. That's by design. Why 2%? Well, there's no reason for it other than 2% is something that people find acceptable. They can get away with it without you throwing too big of a fit. So that's really the message that I try to get out to people. Do your politics, you know, be happy that your guy is in power or not, but
Mhm.
watch out for yourself because there are things that are going on that are bipartisan and that are going to continue on no matter who's in office. Trump may mitigate some of those things. He may make some of those things worse.
Well, and I think the thing about having all these business people around Trump, as well as Trump's business prowess, is they think big.
Mhm.
They have really big ideas, really big ambitions. I mean, just by their nature, that's who they are. They're big thinkers, and
Right.
that's what has led them to such, great wealth is taking these high risk moves. And I
Mhm.
think that what they're messing with right now is very risky. It's very risky because, and even Scott Bessent mentioned this. He said, look, he said, if we have our way, if things work out the way that we plan on it working out, there's going to be pain between now and 2028. But by the time we land this plane in 2028, it's going to be a generational difference going forward. And he said, if we can continue to let the air out of the stock market and begin to let the air out of the deficit, we'll have to attack the debt. And the only way to attack the debt with $1.7 trillion interest rates, interest every paid out every year, is we're going to have to then start cutting into entitlements little by little. We're going to have to lay off workers. We're going to have to cut entitlements. We're going to have to cut government programs. We're going to have to cut the military budget. All these things are going to have to happen in order to lay this plane down correctly. And he said, ultimately, the goal is three things, and I have them written down here. He's like, we're reinventing the economy by delevering government spending, deregulating financial markets, and levering industry into the country. What do you think about this? It's a very ambitious plan, especially something to accomplish in 4 years.
Yeah, I don't think they can. And not because of it's not, I'm not saying they're lying about it. I think that that is legitimately what they would like to see happen. Um, and to be fair, maybe it's just I'm cynical because I am. I'm
I am
I'm
too.
cynical by nature. But I'm also, I'm almost 60 years old, so I've seen a little bit. I've been a political observer for most of my adult life. I've always been interested in politics, and I've learned certain things. And that is that it's very difficult to steer the Titanic, so to speak. And what I do know, I like historical precedents. I think history, when you're looking at markets, when you're looking at politics, is very important because, there's the old saying, history doesn't necessarily repeat, but it often rhymes. You do see themes because human nature is unchanging. Human nature is what it is. And so, for instance, from a historical standpoint, I can say that, in 20 years, gold is going to be worth more today than it is today. That's just because that's the nature of gold. It's 5,000 year history of it being money, right?
Mhm.
In politics, we can go back to, I believe it was the Grover Cleveland administration was the last time that we had a president leave office with less debt than when he entered. Every president since then has left office with more debt than when they entered. And so, I remember. Do you remember the Republican Revolution in the '90s? It
Hmm.
was Newt Gingrich and the contract with America, and they were going to come in and we're going to cut spending and we're going to lower taxes. Didn't happen. You know, every single president leaves with more debt. And that's just the reality of politics because, again, it's short sighted and there's just certain momentum to things. So here's what I think will happen. This is my crystal ball, and it's just really based on the cycles that I've seen in recent history. You're going to see a massive crash in the stock market. You're going to see some kind of financial crisis and you're going to see a recession, just like you did in 2008. Again, we have not reckoned with the monetary malfeasance from those 2+ decades. So that is still in the pipeline. We still have to have our 2008 financial crisis of this thing. And people will say, well, Mike, you've been saying this for quite a while now, and it's been a little bit. Are you sure about that? Well, go back and look at the trajectory of the 2008 financial crisis. In 2006, the Fed started cutting interest rates. So they were aware that there were problems and there were some things, oh, there's some problems in subprime. Better be careful. But then everybody was like, oh, no, everything's great. And then we got to 2007 and the Fed's still cutting interest rates, but everything's great and the economy's great. And people like Peter Schiff who were saying, there's a problem over here in this subprime mortgage market. They're like, no, those guys are nuts. And then even into 2008, everybody was saying the economy is fine. So it takes a while for this type of monetary policy to really manifest in the consequences. So I figure about right now we're in, early to mid 2007 is kind of where I see us.
Hmm.
So when we get the stock market crash and recession, what is going to happen? Well, what has happened with every other economic downturn? Government has ramped up spending. We have stimulus, and the Federal Reserve cuts interest rates and starts printing money. I have no doubt that that's what they'll do again because that's what they do. And so you're going to have another cycle of inflation, and they're going to try to blow up the bubbles again. And maybe they will, and maybe they won't. At some point, they're not going to be able to do it. I love the analogy of a drug dealer. Okay. And I think this resonates with a lot of people. It's not original to me. I'm kind of borrowing it, but we'll take it for what it is. But the economy is basically like a drug addict. It is addicted to easy money, low interest rates, money printing. Economy loves it. It stimulates, right? It incentivizes borrowing and spending, and that's how our economy runs. But what's the problem with being a drug addict? Well, first off, you need more and more drug to get the high, right? And
Hmm.
eventually you overdose. Being a drug addict is not healthy, right? So an economy addicted to easy money, that is not a healthy economy. So every once in a while, the Fed, and the Fed is the drug pusher in this analogy, the Fed comes along and says, you know what, drug addict, I don't want to kill you because you're a good customer. So we're going to take some of the drug away, right? So that's what they're doing or have done in the last year or so. They've raised interest rates. They've shed assets off their balance sheet. They've tightened the money supply. And it's in effect taking the drug away from the addict. Well, what happens to a drug addict when he doesn't get his drug? He goes into withdrawal. You get the shakes. You can have withdrawals that will ultimately be fatal. I mean, if the withdrawal is bad enough. So the economy right now is in withdrawal. That's why everybody wants interest rate cuts, even though inflation is still far above the 2% target. So ultimately, the drug dealer, the Fed, is going to give the victim its drug. And I don't care who the president is. This is what they do. We saw it during the pandemic. It started under Trump. If you want to look at the root of the price inflation we got, that really started under Trump. People like to blame Biden, and he certainly contributed to it. But the Trump administration kept right on spending, and the monetary policy did what it did. So this is what's going to happen. And that is going to lay waste to any 5-year, 100-year, 10-year, whatever plan you want to make, because nobody really has control over the monetary policy other than the people in the Federal Reserve, and central bankers do what they do. And so, when you combine the political realities, politicians are short-sighted. They're not willing to tackle the things and cause the pain, right? As soon as people start feeling pain, they vote the bums out.
Hmm.
So nobody has time. to really inflict that kind of pain. And you can go out and explain it. Well, we're doing these great things. Here's what you're going to get. You're going to get every lefty out there saying, see, Trump's ruining the economy. And then people that are that big mass in the middle is going to go, well, yeah, I guess Trump did ruin the economy. So let's vote for, you know, whatever iteration of Hillary Clinton's next. So
Mm,
I'm just not optimistic. I see these trajectories, I see these cycles, and the really dark pessimistic side thinks that we're going to have a huge crash and reset that's bad enough to make people really rethink the system, because right now everybody's caught in the left right paradigm, and my guy is going to solve the problems of the world, and I'm sorry, your guy's not.
mhm. Okay, so I need a history lesson here then, because my understanding is that was it 1921 there was a crash under Calvin Coolidge and he did nothing. How did he control the Federal Reserve to not uh, intermingle with that crash?
They just didn't. I mean, the mindset of central bankers, and you're talking about the crash that was prior to
The Great Depression.
the Great Depression. Yeah.
Right.
So there was a little mini thing, and yeah, the Fed didn't intervene, and it was just a matter of the mentality of central banking at that time. And I think Coolidge didn't put pressure on the Fed. Let's be honest, the people will try to tell you, oh, the Fed is this politically independent. That's BS. That's
No,
a
it's
bunch
not.
of bull crap. It's as political as anybody. So we happened to have a combination of a central bank that was willing to hands off and an administration that was willing to hands off. Now, when we got to the Great Depression, the mindset had changed, and the central banks were more than happy to oblige FDR. The other thing that I think is important to understand too is that in the early 1920s, we were still technically on a gold standard, right?
Mm,
The gold standard really wasn't severed until we got to 1933 with FDR. And we were in the midst of the Great Depression, and FDR was wanting to do all of this stimulus spending. And of course, the fact that we had hard money was preventing that. And so he basically just made it illegal to own gold, took a whole bunch of new gold into the treasury, revaluated the gold and made it more expensive, and then that allowed the government to print more money.
hmm
So that's another big difference, is that you had a central bank that was operating under a gold standard at that point, and then during the Great Depression that went away, and of course our good friend Richard Nixon severed the last tie to the gold standard in 1972, and the rest, as they say, is history. I mean, you could theoretically, I mean, we go back to Paul Volcker, who is the Fed chair when Reagan was in office. And he's the one that finally dealt with the inflationary pressures of the 1960s and 1970s, which was a direct result of the Vietnam War and all of the Great Society social programs. So you had all of this spending, and you had the inflation, you had money printing. And Paul Volcker got in there and he jacked interest rates up to 20%.
hmm
And that choked the price inflation and allowed for a reset in the economy that, allowed for a pretty significant boom in the 80s and even going into the 90s. But, unfortunately, those things can't go on. And we've never had a Fed chair since then that had the mentality of Paul Volcker. And now I think you have so much groupthink in central banking that it's just, they have their little manual, and it's like, oh, we have a recession. Well, we have to do this, and it's going to be difficult to find somebody in that high level that's going to buck that trend. It's not impossible, but you would really need a different Fed chair. And Trump's instincts aren't very good when it comes to interest rates either, because he's running around even now saying interest rates are too high. He is a businessman. He is a building investor. He loves low interest rates because he likes to borrow money.
hmm
That's kind of the basis of that whole industry. You borrow cheap, you build a big thing, and then you cash in and pay off that inexpensive loan. So I would think that if Trump got the chance to you know appoint a new Fed chair. And I have to remind people he appointed Powell. Powell's his dude. Um, so, you would have to have a situation. I might have just misspoke. I'm not sure. Maybe he didn't, because Powell came in right in that transition. But regardless, um, Trump would be more likely to appoint an easy money guy that he could control, as opposed to somebody who is truly focused on uh, avoiding the monetary malfeasance.
So one of the things I heard a couple of weeks ago was that the entire talk about auditing Fort Knox
Mhm.
was a Peter Thiel idea that he had passed along to Elon Musk, and Elon Musk had passed it along to Trump, and this is where this whole idea came from, was Peter Thiel wanting to reinstate the gold standard. Now, I don't know how easy it would be to re-anchor an economy to gold, but I mean everything that we're talking about is as far as like what the Trump the administration's idea for the economy is a complete revamping, reinvention of the economy. I don't know if they can do any of the stuff that they, like you said. I mean, it's very easy to be cynical about this and look at it and say this is not going to be politically expedient for anybody in Congress. So it's very unlikely to get passed through Congress. But I think part of what we're witnessing is I've heard Trump mention something about the Federal Reserve needs to be responsive to the President of the United States. I know one of the things that they're really fighting hard for is to get in front of the Supreme Court to fight about the unitary powers of the presidency, to where everything that occurs under the executive branch is then determined by the president. He has the ultimate say in it, which is what he's really fighting right now. When you look at like USAID, all the CIA, FBI, all these things are kind of responsive to their own little branches over here, and he's trying to bring it back under the umbrella of the presidency. And if he's successful in doing that, he might have a little bit more say in the spending of the executive branch and of all these it, it, administration, bureaucracies that fall under the executive, which I think is kind of crazy that there are so many bureaucracies under the executive branch that are not responsive to the president at all. It's really wild to see how it works. The more they expose. So, what do you think the chances, number one, that the gold is actually in Fort Knox, but number two, that they're actually going to be able to recalibrate the financial system to another gold standard?
Well, okay, there's a couple of things. First off, is the gold in Fort Knox? I suspect it probably is. Um, and that's just, again, my bias. I don't tend towards really extreme kind of conspiracy theories unless I have some pretty solid evidence. So I don't have any reason to think that the gold is not there. What I think the problem, though, is with the gold in Fort Knox is I have a feeling that a lot of it is what is called encumbered. So it has been loaned or used as collateral for loans, or other entities actually have some ownership stock in that gold that's
Right.
sitting there, that it doesn't really fully belong to the Treasury. And that's the
Like
whole thing.
gold bond type
Yeah, exactly.
situations.
So, it's an audit. It's not just about going and counting the gold bars. An audit involves going through all of the paperwork and how gold has changed hands and all of those things. There is some evidence that gold has been used in that way. And it could be, would not surprise me if a lot of that gold is encumbered. The problem is that, you know, when you start talking about an audit, a good auditing program is you do it every single year. You actually do it ongoing. So I work for a company called Money Metals Exchange, and we have one of the largest gold vaults in the Western United States. It's actually bigger than Fort Knox. And they have multiple layers of auditing, both internal and independent. We don't have that with the Fort Knox Gold. So it invites all of this speculation because they're not being transparent. So we need that transparency. And there are questions. Some people will say, oh, they do audits. Well, they kind of do. They counted the gold in those rooms at one point, and then they put seals on the doors, and then they audit the seals. Well, seals can be tampered with. It's just not
Mm.
transparent. So, that's kind of my view. I think it does need to be audited. I think we would be surprised by some of the things that we learned, but I do tend to think that the gold is probably physically there.
Hmm.
As far as actually going to a gold standard, I don't think it's ever going to happen voluntarily. Again, the government depends on the ability to inflate the money supply, to print money to exist. You can't have the wars and the welfare state without the money printing. And I think ultimately that becomes apparent to these politicians. So that it's a great talking point for people like us to say, yes, we're going to go back to a gold standard. Um, I think it's more likely that the world will be forced back to some kind of hard money standard when these fiat currencies start to completely collapse.
Mm.
I think that the lifespan of the US dollar being the reserve currency of the world is getting short. Um, I think what we're seeing now is what is known as an evolution to a bipolar monetary system where multiple currencies have a place and a play in the reserves. So you see euros and dollars and yuan and gold. You have
Hmm.
so many of these emerging market banks that are buying gold. So people do recognize the importance of gold in the monetary system. And it is possible that we could see some remonetization of gold. Uh, I don't think until we see a true currency collapse will there really be the will to remonetize gold and have a hard currency system. But I think if we did have that type of currency collapse, then there may be enough people out there going, this didn't work so well. Maybe we do need to have some type of hard money. Because really, what hard money does is it puts constraints on government. It
Hmm.
limits the size and scope of government. So obvious why government doesn't want it, right? They don't want their
Right. Yeah.
size and scope limited. So yeah, I think it's interesting. It is good to see these things coming into discussion though, because I've always kind of been a believer that, it starts with having the information out there. And then when you have the crisis, we can draw on these good ideas and maybe they'll overwhelm some of the crappy ideas that we've tried and failed. And then just to touch on the executive branch a little bit, because the whole Constitution thing is kind of my wheelhouse. We have such a distorted government right now in terms of the system as it was intended to be. The way it's supposed to work is you're supposed to have Congress over here that's writing laws and funding things, and then you have a president that does what Congress says to do. It's as simple as that. The president is not supposed to have all of this discretion. The problem that we have is we've got decades where Congress has basically just abdicated its responsibility, and it creates these things like the FDA and these big bureaucracies, and then says, here's a budget. Okay, president, you decide how you want this spent. That shouldn't be the way it is. The Congress should say, we're going to spend X number of dollars on this, X number of dollars on this, and then the president directs that. The president's not supposed to be a decision maker in this system. The United States fought a long, bloody war to get away from having a king. Now we
Hmm.
have an elected king. And I think it's dangerous. I think that's one of the most dangerous evolutions that I've seen in my lifetime is this ascendancy of the presidency, where you almost have this unilateral individual who has all of this power. And there's a really poignant quote by George Washington, which I'm not going to be able to quote accurately in verbatim, but I can give you kind of the uh, interpretation of it. And this was during his farewell address, and he was talking about parties, which they called factions, this partisanship. And he said the dangers of factions is it empowers individuals because you have individuals who are the spokespeople and the leaders of these factions. And so then you've got these factions that battle back and forth for power. And ultimately, it creates cults of personality. And people are Trump, 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 or Biden, Biden, Biden. And they put all of their faith in these individuals. And Washington said at some point, some individual is going to become so popular that he's going to have so much power that he's going to be able to impose total tyranny. And I know there's a lot of people out there that are gung ho on Trump and he's doing all this great stuff. Even if he's doing great stuff, I say be cautious because
Hmm.
one person shouldn't have that much power and he's not going to be there forever. And, a pendulum never stops in the middle. So you've got this swing this way right now. It's going to swing back, and every bit of power that Donald Trump is wielding and using right now is going to go to whoever's next.
Hmm.
And they're going to be doing a lot of stuff that you're going to be going, oh, I don't like this. I don't like this. That's why we were supposed to have a system that was decentralized where most of the decision making was being made at state and local levels, not being imposed from Washington, D.C. That really is the crux of the problem. We have a national government when we were supposed to have a federated republic. This is what you get from a national government. And unfortunately, most people don't recognize that. They like the national government because they think it's going to get stuff done for them. And it might. But I've always said you never want to give anybody power that you wouldn't want your ex-wife to have. And that's what we've done. And it's funny because I remember when we had Obama, and Obama used to talk about, well, I've got my pen and my phone, saying I
Hmm.
can do all of these things. And then when Trump was elected, all the people on the left had this freak out, oh my God, Hitler's president now and he's got all this power. Well, you gave it to him, you lunatics.
Right.
And then when Biden got in, all of that was forgotten. And it's like, oh yeah, Biden, let's just go around. Let's forgive student loans. We don't need Congress to do that, and that was all
Let,
great.
let's
Now
pass an
Hitler's
amendment by tweet.
right. Now Hitler's back in office again, and now the left is all freaked out and the right is all excited. Stop. You know,
Yeah.
at some point, especially you folks out there that identify with libertarianism, the whole idea is to limit the scope of government. You're not doing that by empowering Donald Trump.
Yeah.
That's my soapbox for the day.
All right. I'm going to make you king.
Oh
How do
God.
you fix the financial system?
Uh, I don't. That's the whole nature of a financial system. It should be a free market. We talked about having more. Trump has talked about having a Fed that is more responsive to the president, and then the
Right.
president can. You know what you really need to do? You need to get rid of the damn thing.
Yeah.
There's no reason to have a central bank. Interest rates are prices. Interest rate policy are price controls. What do you get when you have price controls? Messes, right? And yet you have this body of PhDs who think that they know the perfect interest rate as it should be right now, and they're going to impose that by fiat. No wonder our money is a mess. You're messing with the price signals for money. It needs to be a free market. When there's demand for loans, it's going to push interest rates a little bit higher to tamp that down. When demand for loans and money drops, then you'll see interest rates drops. Let the market do what the market is supposed to do. Free markets are always going to be better than pointy-headed academics who think they know more than they do. It goes back to Hayek and the knowledge problem. There is no single individual or group of individuals who can possibly have all of the knowledge necessary to micromanage an economy. It will never work. It didn't work in the USSR. It's not going to work in the United States. So if I was king, I would basically get rid of everything and let the free market work, within the parameters of a court system to make sure that we have contracts are adhered to and basic protections are in place for not killing people. Other than that, let the free market work. The problem is all of these academics, politicians, economists who imagine themselves as being smart and thinking that they can fix things and run things. They can't do it. I can't do it. You can't do it. I don't want to be king. I give my crown back and just leave the market to do its thing.
A perfect example of this is we look back, just look a couple of years ago during COVID and how Fauci just bungled that whole mess. And
Right?
we have little Faucis in the economy every single day bungling.
Perfect analogy, right? And there were those of us in that was 5 years ago, just this month, 5 years ago that we shut down
Seems
the
like it
world
was
for
yesterday.
two weeks to flatten the curve, right?
Yeah.
And you go back and you look at some of that stuff, and I was like, God, that was stupid. And some
Hmm.
of the things some of us knew was stupid at a time. When I realized it was stupid? When they closed the beach. They
Yeah.
closed the freaking outdoors. I'm like, what? Yeah,
Yeah.
we did that here in Florida. You know, everybody talks about DeSantis as being so great on COVID. He was good after he was awful. But yeah, it's exactly the same thing. You can't micromanage a virus. You can't micromanage an economy. You can't
Hmm.
micromanage people. We're all individuals. We all have human action. We all have different desires and needs and wants. The market has to sort those things out. And again, I'm not naive. I know markets aren't perfect. You know, there's going to be problems in any kind of economic system because we have scarcity. But
Hmm.
what is the best way to pass out limited assets, to allocate those things to the right things? Only a market can do that. Only a price structure can do that. Only hands off can do that because all of the thinkers get in the way and they just muck stuff up. And we're mucked up to the nth degree right now.
Yep. All right, man, plug away.
Plug away. So, like, send people where I want them to go.
Yes, sir. 10th Amendment Center, all that good jazz.
That's funny. I could tell people where they want to go. No, we won't do that. So yeah, there's a couple of places I would love for folks to check out. Since we're talking primarily about the economic stuff right now, I would send people over to moneymetals.com/news. And that's the news and action part of Money Metals, which is a gold dealer. We sell gold and silver and precious metals, coins, bars, etc. But if you go to moneymetals.com/news, you'll find all of my economic writing is there. I do a podcast every Wednesday called the Midweek Memo, where I talk about all of this stuff and pontificate. We also have a Friday podcast where we do interviews with interesting people. In fact, I get to interview the author of the creature from Jekyll Island tomorrow, so that'll be cool. Dude's
Oh, cool.
93 years old and still working. So that's where you'll find that I write in depth about monetary policy, the debt, all of these things that are going on, and try to dig into it in a way that folks can understand. And if you want to buy precious metals, you know, it's always a good thing. Highly recommend Money Metals as your go-to place to buy gold and silver. If you're interested in more of the political stuff, you can go to 10thamendmentcenter.com. We're still over there trying to decentralize to bring the federal government back within its constitutional constraints, Trump notwithstanding. And we've made all of the right mad because we still insist that the Constitution should be followed, even though there's a president that people like. And we're doing a lot of work over there, trying to practically limit the scope and power of the state. So we've got some really interesting bills that are moving through. One of the main things I would love people to check out is Defend the Guard.
Come on. Oh, how did the internet jack up on me this time?
I hear you, but you're frozen. There you are.
There it is. Yeah, the internet froze on me again. Ah, we almost made it. All right. Yeah, defend the guard.
So I would love people to check out this really important piece of legislation at the state level called Defend the Guard. I know that Scott Horton over at the Libertarian Institute has been really involved in pushing this. It's a state level bill that would prevent the governor from releasing National Guard units into active duty combat unless there's a declaration of war or one of the constitutional provisions for calling up the militia are met. So this would really help rein in the warfare state. We're also doing a lot of stuff in the realm of sound money. We're seeing states doing things to try to incentivize the use of gold and silver as money, remonetize it. There are things at the state level that can be done. We're still working to limit state cooperation with enforcement of federal gun control. So all kinds of things that you can do at the state level. Limit the surveillance state. Bang on your microphone. Lots of things that we can do at the state level. Check that out over at 10th Amendment Center. If this is something you're unfamiliar with, this whole idea of nullification or using state power against the feds, if you go to 10thamendmentcenter.com, you can go right on the very front page and you can find we call it the State of the Nullification Report. It's like this big, long PDF report. It's a free download and it will explain the strategy, the history, and how it's being implemented. So folks can check that out as well.
And one thing I learned about defend the guard that I learned from Scott Horton last time he was on the show is Pete Hegseth is actually backing defend the
He
guard,
has.
which is
He has endorsed it, which is really
yeah,
surprising.
that's huge. That's
Yeah.
huge. So,
So
Mike, I always appreciate you coming on. I'll stop the recording here and we'll chat for a minute.